I thought that meant to boot it again. Kick it again. Okay. It seems to be recording now, so hopefully we'll be in shape. This week we come to Parashat Chayei Sarah, which in context seems a little bit of a letdown. If you think about last week's Parashat Vayera, which remember we discussed in particular the crimes of Sodom and Gomorrah, but if you remember we started off with a list of everything that was in Vayera. The announcement of the coming of Isaac, the birth of Isaac, the expulsion of Hagar and Ishmael, the visitation by God and the angels to Abraham and Sarah, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, as we talked about, and most notably, of course, the spiritual high point and the final test for Abraham, the Akedah, the almost sacrifice of Isaac. When we get to Chayei Sarah, it's almost prosaic. You know, we have, yes, many things that need taking care of. We have life cycles, but gone are the spiritual visions of being wrapped, in the presence of God. Gone is standing on the top of the mountain, with your hand poised above your son at the spiritual pinnacle of devotion. Now it's property transactions, buying a piece of land to bury his wife. It's pretty prosaic. And just when that exciting haggling finishes, we then cut to getting a wife, which again is a fairly prosaic account. And then once all that's done, we get to hear about the other woman, Abraham's other wife, Ketura, and those children. Where's the spirit? Where's the uplift? Where's the earth-shattering events? No. There's a couple different explanations, and I just want to offer this because it's a bit off from our main topic, but I wanted to draw your attention to it nonetheless, is that we generally do not spend our lives living in those moments of spiritual high points and that pinnacle of connection to God, those transcendent moments. They're called transcendent for a reason, because we are disconnected or elevated beyond this world. But that isn't where we shop. That isn't where we rest at night. That isn't where we cook our meals. That isn't where we bury our dead, and it isn't where we find our spouses. And so Chayei Sarah comes as, in fact, a perfect counterpoint to make sure that we understand that connecting to God and living a life devoted to God and to Torah is not just about standing on the mountaintop, and it's not just about arguing with God over Sodom and Gomorrah and the righteousness. It's about standing with God when burying our dead, and God standing with us. It's about standing with God when finding the right spouse, and God standing with us. And about how we continue on after we have lost a spouse. And that's in fact where we're going to spend most of our time, is on the second half of Abraham's life, which begins after Sarah dies. Maybe we'll see some differences of opinion on that. All right, so without further ado, let's get down to some text. We're going to begin on page 138. This is chapter 24 in the book of Genesis, and we're going to begin at verse 61. For those of you just joining the story and who haven't been reading ahead, what? I'm okay. For those of you that are just joining the story who haven't been reading ahead, this is picking up at the very end of the long discussion of how it was that Rebekah came to be the woman that was going to come back to marry Isaac. Remember, Isaac had stayed in the land of Canaan, and the servant of Abraham had gone back to Haran to find a bride, and we had the whole incident with the camels, and Rebekah showed her generosity, and the rest of her family showed their characteristics, and she decided to leave, and now she's leaving. So, volunteer to read this. Yes, thank you.
Then Rebekah and her maids arose, mounted the camels, and followed the men. So the servant took Rebekah and went his way. Isaac had just come back from the vicinity of Be'er Lahai Roi. Is that how you say it?
Well, it's actually Be'er Lahai Roi, yes.
Roi.
And thank you for drawing attention. That phrase will be important later.
Be'er Lahai Roi. For he was settled in the region of the Negev. And Isaac went out walking in the field toward evening, and looking up, he saw camels approaching. Raising her eyes, Rebekah saw Isaac. She alighted from the camel and said to the servant, "Who is that man walking in the field toward us?" And the servant said, "That is my master." So she took her veil and covered herself. The servant told Isaac all the things that he had done. Isaac then brought her into the tent of his mother Sarah, and he took Rebekah as his wife. Isaac loved her, and thus found comfort after his mother's death.
Okay, so very touching and poignant end to the story of Rebekah, that Isaac has been, since the beginning of the parasha, has been in mourning for the loss of his mother, and now the servant returns with this woman, and after he explains all the details, he recognizes that this is indeed a woman like his mother, that this is indeed a woman that will be a helpmate to him, and in that he finds comfort, and in that he realizes that there is a person who will be with him. And as we, the reader, know, Abraham is going to pass at the end of this parasha, so it is rather important that Isaac not be left entirely alone. Questions or comments on this passage?
Well, Rebecca, what you're saying is that she's similar to Sarah. She's a very strong-willed woman. She's a very independent woman. I mean, the fact that she's...
As we'll see strongly in the next week's parasha.
Yeah, yes. I mean, but even from the very beginning, you get this feeling that she's an equal to Isaac, just if not somewhat.
Well, certainly in many ways. I mean, we could discuss whether she acts almost more like a mother to Isaac in some ways. Now,
Right.
It is important to note that it is only between Rivkah and Isaac that we have the expressions of intimacy as well as of love explicitly among any of the patriarchs. So I wouldn't want to overplay the mother connection.
Right.
But as a protector, Rebekah certainly sees it as her role, and we can argue of whether it was a good decision to protect Isaac the same way Sarah protected Isaac. So the same way that Sarah protected him from Ishmael when Ishmael was behaving in ways that were inappropriate, and that is what led in last week's parasha to the expulsion of Ishmael and Hagar. When Rebekah sees Isaac being taken advantage of by Esau, she also steps in to protect him in some ways by making sure that his blessing goes to the appropriate son. So in that way, she does mirror Sarah as well.
It does seem that he was, it appears when it says he brought her into the tent of his mother, Sarah, that Sarah's tent and all of her things are like still sitting there. Instead of saying he didn't take her into his tent, he took her into...
Correct, exactly. That there's this explicit connection between her and Sarah. That it's not, as you say, her being brought into his own tent, it's she moves into his mother's tent, which I'm sure that some people might find a bit uncomfortable. Seems to work in this situation. But it does raise the issue that chapter 25 is going to put into play, which is, well, there was Sarah's tent, and that means there was Abraham's tent, presumably. And what else was going on as Sarah was being replaced? How was Abraham going to be comforted from his loss of Sarah? How was Abraham going to continue with the loss of this woman that had been with him for so many years and who had gone through so much and traveled all the way across the known world at the time with him? What would his life look like? Isaac has Rivkah. What about Abraham? What happens with him? So, let's keep reading and find out.
Abraham took another wife, whose name was Ketura. She bore him Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. Jokshan begot Sheba and Dedan. Is that right?
It's close enough.
The descendants of Dedan were the Asherim, the Letushim, and the Leunim. descendants of Midian were Ephah, Epher, Enoch, Abida, and Eldaah. All these were descendants of Ketura. Abraham willed all that he owned to Isaac, but to Abraham's sons by concubines, Abraham gave gifts while he was still living, and he sent them away from his son Isaac eastward to the land of the east.
All right, so pause there. Well, what just happened?
Well, I'm confused. If he takes Ketura as a wife, then she's not a concubine, I don't think. So it seems that her kids got sort of short shrift.
All right, so we've got this question of what was Ketura's status and who this woman is in the first place, since I don't think we ever talk about Ketura in general conversation. And B, what happened to her kids here? Did they just get written out of the will?
Their Hanukkah present told me.
They got their Hanukkah present and then shown the door. So we're going to come back to this, but I'm good that we're already zeroing in on some of these issues of who she was, what was her status, and what was the status of her children. Everybody seeing these issues? Okay, let's round out a little bit more so that we have all the complexities, and then we'll be able to go back and try and make some sense of it.
This was the total span of Abraham's life, 175 years. And Abraham breathed his last, dying at a good ripe age, old and contented, and he was gathered to his kin. His sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave of Machpelah, in the fields of Ephron, son of Zohar the Hittite, facing Mamre, the field that Abraham had bought from the Hittites. There Abraham was buried, and Sarah his wife. After the death of Abraham, God blessed his son Isaac, and Isaac settled near Beer Lahai Roi.
And just read one more line for me.
This is the line of Ishmael, Abraham's son, whom Hagar the Egyptian, Sarah's slave, bore to Abraham.
All right, I'm not going to make you read all the other names.
Bless you.
But I wanted to make sure that we understood that right after Abraham's death, we then get an additional set of genealogical information that covers Ishmael. All right, so let's make sure we've got the family tree here, or at least our first
Ketura's
attempt.
family.
What's that?
So then what happens to Ketura's family?
Okay, so we've got Abe, right? Abe is married to?
Sarah.
All right, so first we're going to talk about Sarah. And Sarah produces? All right. He's also married to?
Ketura.
Well, let's start with the more famous one, Hagar.
Okay.
And Hagar produces?
Ishmael.
And then in this chapter, 25, we now meet
Ketura.
and she produces?
A lot of kids.
No, it's not a lot. It's
12. There's 12.
well, 12 eventually, but there are 6 that are born directly. That is to say, we hear about other generations, but to her specifically, there are only 6. And I'm not going to write out all of their names. All right, so we got 6 kids from her. Sarah has Isaac after Hagar had Ishmael,
Right.
and it would appear that Ketura has her kids after Isaac. Correct?
Right.
Any problems with that?
You mean like the firstborn?
You mean with the genealogy?
No, with the sequencing here. Let me ask you this again. Why did Hagar and Ishmael ever happen?
Well, because Sarah couldn't have children.
Because Sarah couldn't have children because she was barren. And so they said, we will have a child and it'll be Ishmael. That sort of relationship didn't work out. And so it didn't end up that Ishmael was counted as Sarah's child, unfortunately. And then how did Isaac come?
When Sarah was very old.
When Sarah was very old, and that meant that Abraham had stopped aging? Abraham as well, in Sarah's own words, and which famously God didn't repeat to Abraham for fear of offending him, and causing strife between husband and wife. And Abraham was also much older than was expected to still be having children. And now he's even older, and he's got 6 kids. So if these kids were born after Isaac, aren't they even more of a miracle? Right? Now, these are the real miracle kids. I mean, he was practically a baby when he had Isaac. I mean, this is another 40 years worth of his life that he's living after Sarah has passed. Huh? Okay, but let's set that aside for one moment. We'll come back to the question of who Ketura was and when he married her. But let's go back to the original question of who gets what? What's that? The firstborn? That was Ishmael. Well, Ishmael certainly seems to get a little bit of better status than these guys.
Yeah.
Because Ishmael shows up for the funeral. Right, we saw that in the middle paragraph there on page 140, right? Verse 9. His sons Isaac and Ishmael bury him in the cave of Machpelah. Right, that's in modern day Hebron. So Ishmael seems to have a better status than these guys, but who do we, the omniscient reader, know is the true inheritor of the covenant? Right. Abraham, through Sarah, through Isaac, is going to become Israel. And that's kind of the focus of the book, right? We got to remember we have a plot here. So if he's inheriting the covenant, what do these guys end up with?
Well, Ishmael is the leader of a mighty nation,
So,
we know, which he was foretold.
nation, and
They disappear.
no, they don't.
No.
They disappear from the annals of modern history, absolutely. But for the ancient reader, these would have been familiar nations and tribes that surrounded, and, well, mostly to the east, the nation of Israel. So they did not disappear. These other children of Abraham were alive and well for most of the ancient times. Well, not always well, to make a little bit of a judgment. But they were definitely seen as still being around and being nations and being descendants and distant relatives through the shared father of Abraham. But in the end, Abraham dispossesses himself. How? How does he dispose of his blessings? Who gets what?
Isaac gets everything, and the Ketura's children get gifts while they lived, but didn't inherit.
All right, so we get inheritance and gifts. So gifts are voluntary allotments of whether it be land, flocks, gold, goods, or other things that were given to all of his other children. But the implication, of course, is that the inheritance of the ultimate gift, the ultimate property, the land of Israel, goes to Isaac. Does that make sense?
Right, and he sends the other ones away.
And he sends the other ones away. And yet there's something odd in the ordering here, because those of you that have read through the Torah before will probably note that there's something a little different in the pattern of the death scene here. When we get to the time when Isaac is feeling like he is drawing near to his end, what does he do? Isaac, old, blind, thinks he's going to die.
Trying to get the blessing.
He calls his son in, Esau. Bad choice, but he calls Esau in because he wants to give Esau his blessing, right? When Jacob, who is the one who ends up getting the blessing, is old and getting ready to pass away, he calls Joseph and his 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, in for a blessing. When Joseph is old and dying, he calls in the family as well. And what do we have here? Who did Abraham give his blessing to?
You assume he gave it to Isaac.
I'm sorry, what was that word?
He
Assume?
must
We
have given
assume?
it to Isaac.
We assume we are told
It doesn't
we are told explicitly that he does not. So if you look at the verse 11, after the death of Abraham, who does the blessing? God blessed his son Isaac. So we're going to begin with a text that tries to explain why it would be that God would be doing the blessing. Sorry, a little more energetic throw than expected, rather than Abraham. How we doing? Coming that way? Just enough? Good. All right. So who wants to read our first text here from Bereshit Rabbah, from Genesis Rabbah, the great collection of Midrashim?
Abraham said to himself, if I bless Isaac now, I will have to bless the children of Ishmael and of Ketura. But if I do not bless them, how will I be able to bless Isaac? Surely what he wants in his world will happen. And so it happened that after Abraham's death, God revealed himself to Isaac and blessed him as his father had intended to do.
So what's the family issue here? Why doesn't Abraham call Isaac in to be blessed?
Because of all the others.
Yeah, how if I call Isaac in to be blessed, I have to call everybody in. And then everyone's got to get a blessing. And maybe I can give a bigger blessing to Isaac, the same way that Esau says, don't you have any blessing left for me? Maybe they could differentiate some, but then I would have to give my blessing to these other guys. And apparently Abraham's not happy to do that. He doesn't want to give a blessing to his children. Seem a bit odd for someone that was very disturbed when it seemed that he would have to send Hagar and Ishmael out and needed God to tell him to do what his wife had told him. I mean, Abraham does not seem like the kind of person who we know midrashically argued when God first told him to do the Akedah, and God said, take the one you love. He said, I love them both, at least according to the midrash. Abraham did not seem to be making distinctions between Isaac and Ishmael in terms of his love or in terms of what he would want for their future. We may know the covenant will continue through Isaac, as God has said, but that doesn't mean that Abraham as a father would necessarily have rejected his children. So what's the issue here? Well, Barbara, you actually hinted a little bit.
The legalities of this relationship. Hagar was a slave, not exactly a wife. And Ketura is called a wife, but it sounds as though that she's regarded as a concubine.
Yeah, over here it says she's a concubine.
Right, so it seems, because he says he gave gifts to the children of his concubines, it seems that the major distinction here is that up here we've got wife, and down here we've got concubine. And that there is a distinction of how the two different categories are treated. And this we know historically was very much true, that the child of a concubine was not always treated the same way a child of a wife was. And the concubine herself, obviously, was not always treated and did not have the same responsibilities towards, the same way that a person would have a responsibility towards a wife. But going beyond the social construct of their own generation, I think we're also seeing some post-generational influence in this midrash. Remember, the midrash, although it was meant to reflect the wisdom that had been passed down, also reflected the wisdom of the writer's own day and age. And what do we know about the children of Ishmael and many of the other tribes of Ketura that existed for the history of Israel after the time of Abraham and on into the time of the rabbis who were writing the Midrashim?
A lot of them were at war with the Israelites.
Yeah, these were not such good neighbors. for much of our history. You know, Ishmael's children and the children of Ketura, more often than not, made our life difficult. And more often than not, they were associated with idolatry and with pagan practices that we found reprehensible. And so I think what the text is trying to do here, the Midrash is trying to do, is say Abraham was divided within himself of how he would treat his children, because he could see, according to rabbinic idea, he's a prophet, he could see the future, he knew what would be coming from these nations, and he didn't want to deny and reject them. He gives them gifts after all. He doesn't want to treat them poorly. But on the other hand, he's not entirely willing to wrap them in the blessing that he wants to see for Isaac and for the nation of Israel. And so in the end, let God sort them out. God will bless whoever God wants to bless, and I'm not going to choose between my children. I'm not going to label this one worthy and this one not worthy. I'm not going to cause that split. I'll let God figure it out. And God has said the covenant of the land goes to Isaac, but my blessing, the blessing that I might give, God can be my agent for transmitting that where God feels it is most appropriate. And so we see God acting as such. If Isaac had realized his father's wisdom, perhaps we would not have had the break between Jacob and Esau, whereas Isaac feels he can choose which one to bless, and ends up creating a blood feud between Jacob and Esau that lasts, long beyond the story in the text itself, between those two nations, continued for centuries later. Make sense? All right, and indeed we can find confirmation of this in the rabbis' imagining of what happened when Alexander the Great marched through and took over the Persian Empire, which, remember, we were a part of ever since the Persians beat the Babylonians. And when Alexander the Great comes through, they imagine, what would the children of Ishmael and Ketura have done? So, Sandy, you were reading, weren't you?
Okay.
Can you keep reading for the next paragraph?
During the time of Alexander the Great, the offspring of Ketura and of Ishmael came before Alexander and argued against Israel. The land of Israel belongs to us and to you, for we also are the children of Abraham.
All right, so they show up before Alexander the Great and they say, "Hail the great conqueror. By the way, we'd like to ask for full rights in this territory, because we're the children of Abraham too." Right? And we don't think this barrier between that inheritance should exist. We think we should have inherited equally with Isaac. You appeal to the new authority. Keep going.
Gabiha ben Hesisa came and said to the rabbis, "Grant me permission and I will go and plead against them before Alexander the Great. If they defeat me, then say, you have bested the commoner among us. And if I defeat them, tell them, the Torah of our teacher Moses has defeated you."
Beautiful little side tactic I kept in here just because it's so typically the way the rabbis think. So he says, look, I'll go plead our case before Alexander the Great. Now, he's not a rabbi. He's no great macher. He's not anybody big in the community. And he says, this way you got nothing to lose. Because if I go out and I argue our case and I lose, you can say, oh, he was just some commoner. That wasn't our real argument. And then someone who's more prominent in the community can go and argue a second time. On the other hand, if we win, then I didn't win. It's the Torah of Moses, case closed. We're all done. So it's setting it up very nice to make sure they can always have a second chance. Sounds good? Yeah, this is why Jews make good lawyers.
They appointed him, and he went and disputed with the offspring of Ketura and of Ishmael. He asked, "What proof do you bring for your claim?" They replied, "From the Torah." The Lehat ben Hesisa retorted, "I too will bring a proof from the Torah. It is said, Abraham willed all that he owned to Isaac, but to Abraham's sons by concubines, Abraham gave gifts. If a father gives his children bequests in his lifetime and sent them away from each other, has anyone a claim against each other?"
All right. So his proof is the verses that we just read. that while Abraham was still alive, he gave the other sons gifts and sent them away? And the answer is, well, in any other case of inheritance, if the father gives gifts to his different children while he's still alive, when he dies, can they complain about the gifts he gave them while they were alive? Can they bring them to court? You know, if I'm, the son of Warren Buffett, and he gives my brother a Lamborghini, and he gives me a bicycle, and then he passes away, can I take my brother to court for half the Lamborghini?
Depends on the lawyer.
Depends on the lawyer. If he's got a good Jewish lawyer, maybe. So no. But Jewish law, as opposed to American law, would say no. That gifts given while somebody was alive cannot be contested after someone has died, even if the gifts are given at the near moment of death and clearly are meant to supersede or circumvent the normal laws of inheritance. A gift given while living cannot be contested. That it is a permanent gift, and no one has any claim to argue against it, unless there were other liens against the property beforehand. But if the property was free to be given, and it was given while he was alive, it's given. And that's their rebuttal, is that...
Why does that mean they have no claim to inheritance?
Because if he had wanted them to inherit, he would have said, you're inheriting. He said, and Isaac inherits all that I own. And you guys get package A, package B, package C, which just so happen to be easily transportable. There's the border.
Okay, but in Jewish law, that's the way it goes.
Correct. Well, in Jewish law, if...
British common law, or American law, they would still have the right to...
Right, well, so...
Against the estate.
Right, so in Jewish law, if there was anything left for inheritance, yes, there would be an issue. Although, again, concubines don't have the right of... the children of concubines don't have the right of inheritance. But three equal brothers from equally statist wives would indeed be able to divide whatever was remaining from the inheritance. And there's a lot of medieval records of families trying to figure out how to give what they wanted to give to the son they wanted to give it to, rather than to the other sons they didn't want to give it to, because Jewish law is actually very fair when it comes to most inheritances. And so they had to make sure they gave things before they died to make sure that it wouldn't go to people they didn't want to go to. There's a lot of chicanery that goes into this to make sure that you can actually give who you want to give to rather than giving it automatically. And rabbis were sometimes supportive of this and sometimes were opposed to this because it would mean bypassing the natural path of inheritance.
The text that's written would indicate that Ishmael understood the setup, because if he thought he had claim to the land when he came back to bury his father, that would have been his time to make claim to the land. But he didn't. He came and then left.
Indeed. So Ishmael, at least implicitly, thinks he does not have that claim. But this is centuries later, and as we see in this case in the Sanhedrin, as we see explicitly in later cases in Jewish law, not in Jewish law, but in the Tanakh, people will often raise claims when they think they have an opportunity to get away with it. Not necessarily because it's either a just claim, or not necessarily because they couldn't have raised the claim earlier. So here, with a new ruler in town, with Alexander the Great having just taken over everything and disrupted the patterns of authority that had been in the Persian Empire, they think they got an opening. They think they got a chance with this new king, so to speak. And so they're going to press a claim even though in the past they clearly had relinquished that claim.
Is this not happening today?
Well, it depends on how closely we'd like to tie in the title of children of Ishmael or the children of Ketura to the people who currently live in those lands. We often do so rhetorically, but historically Judaism was actually very reluctant to assign any of the people who lived in any of the lands that surrounded Israel the official name of being a member of any of the original groups that had lived there. So,
But the opposite side of that coin is,
yes.
they're the ones that saying that Israel, that they have a legal stake in Israel.
Yes, they do. Well, let's finish this text and we'll see some of the response there. Sandy, you want to just finish off the last sentence there?
The offspring of Ketura and of Ishmael immediately left behind their sown fields and their planted vineyards and fled. That year was the sabbatical year, and Israel enjoyed the fruits of the abandoned field.
So we see that there were people who were of Ishmael and Keturah who were living in the land of Israel. That they were residents of the land of Israel. They were not children of Israel. That is to say, they did not have the official claim to the land that came through the covenant, but they were owners of the land, or they were tenants of the land. And in response to having their claim rejected so soundly, they chose to flee. It's not exactly clear why they decide to flee, other than in the fact that it ends up benefiting us. During the sabbatical year, of course, we cannot plow and plant our own property. They had done their own, and so now we were able to enjoy the fruits of their labor, even while we couldn't labor on our own.
Sounds like what the Palestinians did in 48-67.
So
You need water?
I think I'll be okay. We're only a little bit longer. Definitely sounds very similar to the idea that during the 48 War, the War of Independence, that many people moved out of the way of the armed conflict in anticipation of returning sometime later. And in the process, reshaped entire neighborhoods and regions of Israel from what they had been just prior to the 48 War. The exact connections are going to be very hard to establish, and that's actually one of the sticking points in the peace process for the so-called right of return for Palestinians, of whether they have the right to return to the homes that were left behind in 48. But that's a problem that's going to be solved by people outside of this room. So we're going to go back into the family relationships, because really all of this comes down to the fact that Abraham was married to somebody other than Sarah. If he just had only one wife, this wouldn't have been a problem, right? It would have been him and Sarah and Isaac, the nuclear family, and the lines of inheritance and the lines of your claim would have all been perfectly clear. So why did he get married to this Ketura woman? Okay, let's argue that he had to. Who'd like to read the text on the back from Rambam? All right, Sandy, you're still on then.
Even if a man has fulfilled the mitzvah of be fruitful and multiply,
Meaning he's had children.
it is a mitzvah from the word of the scribes that being fruitful and multiplying never ceases as a commandment all the time he has spoken.
Which means you have to be fruitful and multiplying this as much as you can, as long as you can. Just because you have fulfilled the mitzvah doesn't mean you stopped trying to be more fruitful and more multiplicatory. Got that?
Sure.
Keep having kids as long as you can.
For anyone that adds a single soul to Israel, it is as if he has built a world. The sages commanded likewise that a man should not dwell without a wife, lest he succumb to rude thought. And a woman should not live without a husband, lest she be suspected.
All right. So, according to the general halacha, a widow or widower should seek to remarry, even if they are past the age of being fruitful and multiply, and certainly if they are still within the range of being fruitful and multiply. And a man should do so because a man alone is prone to start getting ideas about things that he might like to do, and then he's prone to start acting on those ideas. And a woman alone is likely to become under suspicion by the community for what she might be doing in that lone house with someone else's husband, so to speak.
Not a good thing.
What's that?
Not a good thing.
Not a good thing. It's not pleasant to be in communities where that kind of gossip is spreading. So, according to this then, after Sarah died, Abraham had to get married. I mean, he's got almost another 40 years worth of life. So, is he going to spend 40 years alone? Is that what should have happened? All right. Well, how do we know doubly so?
And the Lord God said, it is not good that a man should be alone. I will make him a helpmate. I will make him
A helpmate. Mate for him.
I will make him a helpmate for him.
Pardon my typo. So we even know all the way back from the very beginning of Bereshit, the very beginning of Genesis, that God says it's not good for man to be alone. The whole creation of having a separate identity between male and female was so that there could be help for each other, that they could be with each other. And therefore to be only by yourself is to be almost half a person. All right, onward.
If a man's wife dies and he has grown children, he should first see that they are married before taking a new wife for himself.
And how do we know Abraham was following that? Because Rebekah and Isaac are the chapter immediately before. So you get Rebekah and Isaac, you get Abraham's, Sarah dies. Next chapter, Abraham says, I need to find a wife for my son. Next chapter, he finds a wife for himself. It fits the pattern precisely.
Rabbi said, Hagar is the same as Ketura. Why is she called Ketura?
Wait a minute, what? What did you just say?
Why is she called
No, hold on, wait. Let's make sure we didn't just gloss over that. You just told me that Hagar and Ketura are the same person? Excuse me? What's that?
That's what it says.
That's what it says there. That's what it says there. That Hagar and Ketura are the same person. And this is indeed a widely discussed midrash. That when it says that Abraham married Ketura, it's not saying that he actually married someone new. It's saying that he took Hagar back. That she had been sent out, remember in last week's parashah. And now that Sarah has died, he is reunited with Hagar.
Did he ever actually marry her?
What's that?
Did he ever actually marry her the first time?
Well, he took her to wife, but it was as this sort of pseudo-concubinage, handmaiden to Sarah surrogacy. And so the question of whether she was married or not is one that is debated. And even in this case, he doesn't seem to marry her, but she is still called explicitly a concubine. Were you going to say something, Didi?
No, I just thought that Hagar and Ketura shared the same status. But, I mean, that's my train of thought.
Right.
Not that they were one and the same person.
And indeed, it's not exactly self-evident why you would think Hagar and Ketura were the same person. I mean, they have two different names, but they do go on to try and justify this, or Rabbi does.
Because she was completely celibate after originally being banished by Abraham. But the sages said he married a different woman.
All right, so they say that the reason she's called Ketura, which can mean incense or can mean bound up, is because she was sweet once she left, that she reformed her ways, and that she was celibate. She wasn't going around and marrying other people. Because after all, we know from later Torah that if a man divorces a woman and she marries another man and then divorces that man, she cannot remarry the first husband. That if a man divorces a woman and she remains unmarried, they can still remarry at a later date. So she would have to have remained non-married, she would have to have remained celibate in between the expulsion and now this return. Following that? So which is better? Is it better for Abraham to be bringing Hagar back, now nicknamed Ketura, or is it better to just say it was a different person altogether? Which one makes you happier?
I mean, we have our pick.
Yeah. Well, we have two eminent authorities right here. We have Rabbi and we have the other Chachamim, the other sages saying two different things. One says Ketura was Hagar and one says no, she wasn't. So you can pick.
Make an honest woman out of her.
Make an honest woman out of her. So the reformation of Hagar, the reconciliation of Hagar, has perhaps a a nice tone to it. That however, it seemed that there might have been some mistreatment in the past, that in the end, things worked out. A positive feeling?
How many years are we talking about here?
Well,
And how is Hagar, how does she exist? I mean, how does she, if she's completely celibate, she's sent out,
mhm.
Ishmael is
Of indeterminate age.
indeterminate age, probably,
Well, the last contact we know for sure he had with his father was at 13 when he was circumcised.
right.
He may or may not have been expelled before or after that.
But that means, and 40, so this has to, it's many years later, isn't it?
Could be 10, 15.
That's right.
Yeah. It wouldn't have been
So
like,
she's
it wouldn't have been the
someplace-
next month.
Right, so she's someplace with Ishmael
Hmm.
in a non-tribal,
Well, Egypt.
oh, she went back to Egypt.
She was Egyptian.
Yes,
Yeah.
I know she was Egyptian, but,
You know, I have to vote that Ketura is a separate person if you consider ages.
Mhm.
While a man may be a father well into his declining years, women usually cannot keep having babies past a certain age. And if she is the mother of Ishmael,
Mhm.
who is older than Isaac, and Isaac's already married, it doesn't seem likely to me that she can, recycling is a good idea. I think that she would not be of an age to then produce 6 more children.
If Ketura was Hagar, she is going to be performing her own miracle to have
To have
6 more
6 more
children.
Well, then there was Sarah who was, you know, way beyond the age of, and she had a child.
But the Torah went out of its way to call that a miracle.
yeah,
Whereas this seems to be describing as just a matter of course.
right.
Well-
I go for the separate people.
And if you were,
Yes.
2 votes.
and if you were
We
Isaac,
decided we shouldn't mix it.
if you were Isaac, remember the one who couldn't be comforted after his mother's death? Would you be comforted by your mother's hated rival returning? No, that you think that might create a little bit of reality TV? You know,
Yes.
that interaction might not be good. Yeah, well, you misjudge Isaac, at least in the eyes of our tradition. Read the next text.
Okay. After marrying Rebekah, Isaac said to himself, I have taken a wife, but my father remains alone. Isaac went to Be'er Lahai-Roi to bring Hagar to Abraham his father, and he should marry her. There is no doubt.
Up, buzz.
Oh, okay.
So who made the match?
Isaac.
Isaac. Now, why in the world would they think that Isaac did this? Why in the world would they think Isaac did this? Where in the world is Be'er Lahai-Roi?
He was mad at him for trying to kill him.
Well, if you were to look all the way back into Genesis 16, when Hagar first ran away from Sarah, where did she end up?
At that well.
At that well. At Be'er Lahai-Roi. In fact, she's the one who names it. So the idea that when it says specifically in our text, right at the end there of when Isaac is meeting Rebekah in page 138, verse 62, that it says he had just come back from the vicinity of Be'er Lahai-Roi, the attuned reader, which our sages of the Midrash were, would say, wait a minute, I know that place. Who's that place associated with? Who was that there that was famous? Wait, Hagar was there. And Abraham gets married in the next chapter? Right after Isaac getting married? We think this is a coincidence? That this was Isaac bringing Hagar back so that his father wouldn't be alone. It's an interesting hypothesis. Now, again, many of the Midrashim are not necessarily here to teach us historically what absolutely happened. I mean, after all, we have numerous rabbis from eminent and venerable generations that all need respect that disagree with one another. So the fact that they were allowed to disagree shows that they had differences of opinion, which we are not therefore accused if we disagree with one or the other. But instead, think about what they are trying to say about the responsibility we have to reach out for each other and our family, even family members that may have made things difficult for us or for people we loved. Think that the sages could even imagine that Isaac would see his father in pain after having lost his beloved Sarah and say, Dad needs to be with someone. He can't just spend the rest of his years without a companion. And I know someone who deserves a second chance. I know someone who could be there for him and who would need him in turn. Even though it meant bringing back a potential rival to his inheritance, even though it meant possibly, taking away some of his father's affection by bringing back his brother Ishmael, even though it might have meant reopening the old wounds of whatever had transpired between him and Ishmael, he put the needs of his father first, according to this midrash. Could have found someone else more suitable. Well, that's why the midrashim that say that Ketura had become more suitable, that she had reformed her ways, that she was a better person, and that she was a nicer person.
It just seems there's so much baggage there. But it's a smart thing to do.
Sometimes there is a lot of baggage, and indeed, like I said, when we try to shoehorn this into a literal reading of, if we were filming this, as I call it, it might not work if we were going to actually shoot the scene. But as a reminder of the lengths that we should try to go, when possible, when the baggage is not insurmountable, to provide for reconciliation, to not only worry about what we get out of the interchanges in our family, but to look at the needs of our other relatives and especially our parents, of what they might be wanting and needing, I think is a very touching lesson from our sages.
I know from going to funerals, one of the things you do at a funeral is you talk to your relatives.
Right.
How's this? How's so and so? And this may be what happened when Ishmael came back. They could have been talking. Oh, how's your mother? Well, she's just sitting home alone doing nothing. But
She's getting by. She misses your dad. Well, maybe we should have coffee sometime. And one thing leads to another, and they have 6 kids. So, all right. Now, if we want to get down to his history, because I know people like to say, but what really happened? We have a whole nother set of options here from one of my favorite commentators, Shadal, who kind of blows all the other midrashim out of the way and sets up his own interpretation. Last one.
There is no doubt that this happened long before and not after Sarah's death.
All right, bold statement. This whole chapter 25, just because it sits at the end of Chayei Sarah, just because it sits in the section of the Torah that comes after Sarah's death and burial, does not mean the events that took place during chapter 25 took place after the events of chapter 24 or 23. And how does he justify this?
There is no before and after in Torah.
Which is a quote. It's a rabbinic phrase that just because two things are put in a particular order in the Torah does not mean the Torah was teaching you chronology. And indeed, we have explicit evidence in other places of the Torah where the Torah clearly told you information at a time you needed to know it, not at the time it actually took place. And that seems perfectly fine for the Torah. It wasn't trying to make a timeline, it was trying to tell you what you needed. And so the basic principle of there is no before and there is no after, meaning you can't always rely on the order of events in the Torah to be the order they actually transpired, is well established within rabbinic understanding. The question is, do we apply it here? And Shadal says, yep, absolutely. Ketura married to him long before Sarah died.
But it waited to mention this topic until after all the events of Abraham's life and close to his death, because it is irrelevant to the matters of the children of Israel. It was only mentioned to show that God blessed Abraham with many offsprings and fulfilled his promise to him. That is why the children of Ishmael are mentioned here as well.
Right, so he says, why does he bother to mention it at all then? You know, if it's being put out of chronology, why mention it at all? That's why? Because Abraham's just about ready to die, and we want to make sure that everybody knows that when Abraham dies, by that point, God has fulfilled for him the promise that he made way back in the beginning, that he would be a father of many nations. So we didn't need to mention that during the whole narrative of Abraham's life, because the narrative of Abraham's life was all designed to get us from Abraham to Isaac to Israel. And we didn't need to interrupt that with these other offspring. But now that we're getting close to Abraham's death, now we need to mention it, lest you think that God didn't fulfill his promise about making Abraham the father of many nations. And that's why it bothers to point out that Ishmael had all these other kids too. You know, he could have mentioned Ishmael's lineage when Ishmael was born. He could have mentioned Ishmael's lineage when Ishmael was expelled. But it wasn't. Why? Because it wasn't germane to the main story. But now we want to make sure we get it in before Abraham's actually dead.
There is no doubt that this was a concubine, as it says later, to the children of the concubines of Abraham. We do not find any concubines of Abraham except this one and Hagar. This is confirmed in Chronicles.
Because Chronicles also mentions concubines as receiving the gifts. And he's pointing out, it's plural, people. Concubines. And plurals generally mean more than one. So if I count Hagar and Hagar, I don't get to plural. It doesn't matter how many nicknames she has.
So it's gotta be Hagar.
So according to Shadal, it's got to be Hagar and Ketura, two separate people who were concubines. Ketura was married or taken as a concubine before Sarah's death, and we don't know. There may have been other children and other women as well. It was not considered a bad thing. Don't tut poor Abraham. This was considered very normal, as we're going to see when Jacob has 12 kids by 4 women. That this is almost too few children to have had. So it is not that surprising. It would not be socially awkward or unexpected. But look, as much as I respect what Shadal has done to harmonize the text with what seems to be a likely historical reading, it's taken all of the moral lessons out of it. It said, the story was just there to tell us about Israel, and this was all extra just to fill in God's promise, and then that's it. Move on to the next chapter. Interesting, helpful, insightful, morally sterile. Look at the way the sages wrestled with the notion of, they have claims against us, and we refute their claims when we talk about the land. Look at the way they argued about, was it Ketura or was it someone else, and who would have, brought her back and tried to reconcile. Those are morally inspiring lessons that the rabbis tried to seek in understanding this difficult and in some ways convoluted text in this last episode of Abraham's life. Shadal kind of bypasses that. And I respect him, and if you were going to ask me how to film the movie, I would vote for Shadal's version. But if you ask me how to teach this so that we can understand better how to treat our own families, I would much rather study the Midrash and much rather learn from there what the rabbis held up as being the ideal behaviors in these difficult situations. Questions? Comments?
No.
See you on Shabbat.
Thank you.
Remember, we have a very special Shabbat this week with our adult Benot Mitzvah.